Hey folks, welcome back to our next chapter's overview of the story. This week we are looking at chapter 2 entitled God Builds a Nation. Now, there is a ton in here, and this story of what we call the patriarchs really overlooks a pretty healthy chunk of history and encompasses a lot of the book of Genesis. Interestingly enough, we're in the book of Genesis for like 3 chapters. Next week, we're actually going to have some more of it as well. But really, we're looking at that. And that is kind of where we are at, the focal point, what is known in the Jewish tradition, if we look at the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, as the period of the patriarchs, as already mentioned. The setting picks up approximately 11 or 12 generations after Noah and the flood. So the world is beginning to repopulate again. That's kind of what's gone on in the meantime. And we have these 3 individuals, these 3 generations who are the recipients of God's promise to eventually build a great nation that would become the Jewish nation or the Jewish faith. We got a bunch of different themes that kind of pop up throughout these. Some of the main ones include the themes of patience and faith, and the change of identity, and God's faithfulness, and also God's unexpected action. So that's kind of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here real quick, and I'll try and keep this as brief as possible. The story in a nutshell that we have as we overcome these 3 generations, God calls this guy named Abram, aka Abraham, same guy, different names, to leave his father's community and go. I'll tell you when you get there. That's pretty much what God says. And so Abram says, okay, sounds good. Let's do that. God makes promises to Abram that your descendants are going to become too numerous to count. And we hear different promises made or different examples given of look up at the stars of in the heavens. Can they be counted? Or look at the sand along the seashore. Can it be counted? Your descendants will be like that. Time passes. Abram's getting a little old and he's like, hey, God, do you remember that? You made those promises. I don't have any kids. What are we going to do about that? And God repeats the promise. Some more time passes. Abram and Sarai try a different tactic, which gets messy. And if you've read it yet, you know what I'm talking about. More time passes. Finally, the child of the promise, Isaac, is born. Now, his story, we don't actually hear a ton of. His story kind of gets glossed over, which actually in the full Bible, it kind of does too. But there are some similar situations to the story of Abram. We kind of hear some repeated themes that go on. It's very reminiscent. A lot of time passes. Eventually, he and his wife have twins, Esau and Jacob. Now, Jacob schemes, although so does his mom. I think that's where he learned it from. Despite a lot of hardship, he is the one who is blessed and is granted with a great family and great riches. And that's kind of what we see, what we cover. That's the overview. So that's the story in a nutshell. Now, some of the different themes that I mentioned. The theme of faith is a big one, particularly when we talk about Abraham. He is known as the example of faith. Why? Well, because God made promises and Abraham believed it, even though he at times questions and doubts, and he has concerns, and he has missteps. Above all and throughout all, he believes the promises of God, and we hear it is credited to him as righteousness, something that will jump up again in the book of Romans, clear off in the distant future from Abraham, our past. I don't know if that's weird, but we hear the Apostle Paul, and I'm jumping ahead of myself here, but he credits the belief of Abram believing God's promise as righteousness. So we kind of see that one, that theme go there. Now, I mentioned identity change. That's something that we hear a lot about too. Now, I've already mentioned Abraham. We see a repeated theme of the identity of the person being changed because of their encounter with God, or because what God has done in their lives. Abram means high father. Here's the thing, in Hebrew in particular, names typically mean something specific. And it is the case here. Abram means high father, which I think is kind of funny considering he's a father of no one at this point. Eventually, he becomes Abraham, which means father of many. Sarah also undergoes a name change, although hers, I don't really know a whole lot of specifics about the why. She goes from Sarai, which means princess, to Sarah, which also means princess. So I don't really know what that distinction is, but it comes about. There's the name change that happens after all of this encounter, even though they kind of seem to mean the same thing, different identity. We also see it with Jacob, grandson to Abram and Sarah. Jacob which means he who grasps the heel, and that stems from the birth story of Esau and Jacob, that when Esau is born, apparently Jacob is like holding onto his heel, which is weird, but okay. And um, so his name goes from Jacob to Israel, and Israel means the one who wrestles with God. And then we see the nation of Israel also wrestling with God. That's some foreshadowing there, but interesting ideas there. So the way that encounters with God can change who we are. And I think that's important for us to remember. The theme of God's faithfulness and unexpected action. Now, above all, God is faithful to the promises first made to Abram and then passed on from generation to generation to generation, even despite the human tendency to mess things up. God is faithful to the promise, even when that human action and impatience overtakes things and gets in the way. God still remains faithful to the promise. And God's timing is not human timing. That's also important to remember. But we also see, in terms of unexpected action, a really great example of this is the way that we continue to see God's favor, God's promise, whatever we want to say, resting on the unexpected son. Now, this is a cultural thing. The oldest son was the one who got everything and got the blessing of the father, got the inheritance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet God seems to do things differently than that. For instance, we have Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah, who's actually Abraham's second son because of Ishmael, who was born to the slave girl Hagar. And that's a whole nother thing. I'll talk about that in a second. But we see that Isaac is actually the second son, and yet that's the one who God seems to favor. Then we see Jacob, who's the second son behind Esau, who is the one who is ultimately favored, even though he schemes his way into it, which I think is kind of funny. And then we go one step farther, and we don't really get into that in this particular chapter. This is foreshadowing of the next chapter. But of all of the sons of Jacob, and there are many of them, Joseph, who is the second youngest, about as far away from being the heir as we can have, he is the one who seemingly receives the promise through a whole bunch of hardships. Again, preview to next week. So we kind of have that theme that it's emerging. Now, here's the last thing that I want to talk about. I want to switch gears just a little bit. And yes, I'm excited and talking fast, and that's kind of the way things go, but I want to get through this. We've got some problematic situations that lie within these stories as well. And I would be remiss to not address those or to not at least acknowledge them. There are different aspects that pop up when we begin to go through this biblical narrative. We see aspects of culture that were vastly different at that time than they are now. And sometimes we may look at these things like, I don't know what to make of that. That seems really problematic. That seems downright icky. And yes, that is the case. For instance, Hagar is the slave of Sarah. Sometimes we'll hear her called the maidservant or the servant, but let's face it, she was a slave. She has no agency in this situation. And it was practice, I'm not saying it's okay, but it was practice that a slave of a wife could have children for the wife. And yes, icky, gross, not cool. Basically, we're talking about rape here because she is given no agency, and yet that did happen. And Hagar was greatly mistreated. She's not given a whole lot of agency, and yet we also see a theme emerge that she is one who names God. I don't remember if that's actually present within what we get from the story, but in the larger narrative, she gives a name to God. God sees her, and that's kind of a really cool thing, despite all the icky stuff that's going on with her. So we see that with Hagar. Now, we skip a couple of generations, and something similar happens. We got Jacob, who at times we say has 2 wives. Sometimes we say he has 4 wives. Well, he had 2 wives, and that in itself is a little different, but each of them also had maidservants, aka slaves, and he had children with them as well. Zilpah and Bilhah are their names. So also, they don't really have any agency in this whole situation either. And again, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us, doesn't compute with us, but at the time that was common. So I just need to reiterate that changes in culture doesn't necessarily mean that we're any better. It's just different, and humanity has kind of moved on from there for what was common practice at the time to where we are at now. And as we move forward into the future, and we are in the past, I'm sure people will look back on us like, what were they thinking? But there's that situation. One other thing that I want to kind of talk about is the sacrifice of Isaac. Well, it's credited to Abraham as being faithful, that you who did not even withhold your own son. Notice he doesn't bat an eyelash when he's asked to to sacrifice his kid. And did anybody else like go like, what's up with that? Child sacrifice was a thing. You had to keep the gods happy, and you had to sacrifice to them. And the more meaningful it was to you, the bigger sacrifice that it was. And so notice, even though it turns out okay, he was willing to sacrifice his own kid, and that's a telltale sign of what went on within the culture at that time as well. Again, different, very foreign to us. And then the last thing that I kind of want to notice or kind of talk about is the exile of Hagar and Ishmael, which seemingly doesn't even happen once but twice. Though God does bless Ishmael. Ishmael his story actually gets a little bit muddled with Isaac as we look at different cultures. His descendants would go on to be the basis for where the Muslim faith or the faith of Islam would originate a long, long time later. But we see that, and actually between the two faiths or the two faith traditions, these stories get muddled. And in the Muslim faith, it's actually Ishmael who was supposed to be sacrificed on the mountain rather than Isaac. And that's why the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is the site where that happened, is considered so important to both religions, to both faith traditions, because of the site where the story happened, even if the identity of the people is different. So sorry that got long. I tried to get that as brief as I could, but that's some of my thoughts of what's going on, some themes that came out of this particular story.